Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2023, an 8-lecture masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. If you've not had the opportunity, we encourage you to view the short introductory video, which explains the mission of the FPA, the Great Decisions program, and also provides a mini lecture on the 4 dominant foreign policy perspectives in the United States. Each year, the editors at the Foreign Policy Association select 8 challenges or great decisions facing the American public and our foreign policy makers. The Great Decisions Handbook provides a mini chapter on each of the Great Decisions topics. In 2023, our topics are energy, war crimes, China, economic warfare, Latin America, famine, Iran, and climate migration. We begin today with topic number 1, which is energy geopolitics. The source of energy that we rely upon has evolved over time. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity relied upon burning wood. Coal, and then in the 19th century, petroleum became the dominant energy source. The global economy, industrialization, trade, all of it has relied upon oil for a very long time. But as we move into the 21st century, other renewable sources of energy are becoming more important, from solar to wind to nuclear. The importance of energy in modern life cannot be overstated. It is an essential component of national strength, security, prosperity, and even survival. That makes energy a truly geopolitical calculation and a very important foreign policy challenge. In making that geopolitical calculation with energy, we must always be flexible because world politics changes very quickly. Think of things along this spectrum: oil exporters to Western markets. There are those countries who we ban imports, such as Venezuela, who must be punished for its non-democratic status. And on the other end of the spectrum, at least until recently, was the Russian Federation, which provided an enormous amount of the oil and natural gas needed by European allies. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, however, the tables are turned. Now we're punishing Russia by banning its energy exports and opening the door to more Venezuelan oil exports. Energy's role in foreign policy varies greatly. It could be as simple as the other country has resources that we need, let's invade and take them. That was the case in the Pacific campaign of World War II, as Japan, which has very few in-state energy sources, felt the need to invade much of Southeast Asia, or more recently, Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait. Another way that energy plays into foreign policy in a very positive way is joining together for international environmental conferences to address the implications of the burning of fossil fuels. We saw that in Rio in 1992 and decades later in Paris. Bilateral agreements between countries demarcating boundaries across their shoreline in order to gain access to natural gas or other energy sources. Classic example here is the 2022 Israeli-Lebanese treaty. 2 countries that do not get along terribly well, and yet they recognized a common interest in demarcating their boundary offshore so that these sorts of oil and gas fields could be accessible by each of them. And then finally, we have the weaponization of energy, using oil or natural gas as an instrument of foreign policy to reward allies and to punish adversaries. Embargoes of oil, reduction of oil production are primary ways of weaponizing energy in world politics. Who amongst us cannot remember the gas shortages of the 1970s, when a group of militarily insignificant countries in an organization called OPEC decided to dramatically reduce production, sending the price of oil, gas, and energy through the roof and really shaking to its foundation the Western economic model. We can see in this graph how dependent Europe has become on Russian oil and gas pipelines. Those pipelines provide significant amounts of energy for Germany, some 62% pre-invasion, and all of that has dropped down to zero. It seems on one day that the West is boycotting Russia, and on the next the Russians are reducing the amount of oil and gas they're willing to export. There's a real game of chicken being played between Russia and Germany in particular over oil and gas supplies. As we look at energy geopolitics today, there will be three main considerations before we turn our attention to foreign policy options. We'll look at the sources of power in general, the role that energy plays in that calculation, enhancing access to energy, and finally, American strengths and weaknesses as it relates to energy geopolitics. We begin with sources of power. Looking at the world's nations, we can place them in order from most powerful to least powerful with very little difficulty. The question becomes, however, how do we calculate power? If we look at a nation and view its military, its economy, and its leadership, we get a pretty good idea of that nation's capabilities, but these are variables that change rather quickly. This is more of a snapshot of what the country looks like at the current moment. If we're interested in looking at a country long-term, what role will China, India, South Africa play in 20, 30, or 40 years, we can't look at leadership, economy, or the military today. We need to look at what I call the anchors of power for every nation state. They do not change very quickly, if at all. One of them is their geostrategic location in the world, their population demographic pyramid, and their geography, the richness of the soil and the energy sources within it. In terms of geostrategic location, some nations are in a very difficult spot. Take Mongolia, which forever has been sandwiched between two massive powers, Russia to the north and China to the south. Germany is in a geostrategic territorial trap. It is located between England, France, Italy, Austria, Russia, historic great powers. And then we have a nation such as Brazil, which really isn't very close to a major power. The closest one would be the United States, which, by the way, has an even more enviable geostrategic location as we are separated by oceans from the nearest great power. The second anchor of power is population, or the demographic pyramid of a nation. For every country, here we see China, we can look at their demographic pyramid. And this one sounds off alarm bells in Beijing. You'll notice the winnowing out at the base, how the population is getting smaller. That tells us that almost without doubt, China's population is going to peak and then very rapidly decline, as reflected in this graph. We see growth of China through 2025, a leveling into the 2040s, and in long term, a rather significant decline in the Chinese population. This is something that Beijing will have to take into account as it creates and executes both its domestic and international politics. And then finally, we have geography, which I've saved for last because that includes the energy question. For each country, we look at its geography. How rich is the soil? How large is the amount of resources under that soil? Is it able to provide food? How about the rivers? Are they long? Are they wide, navigable? Do they connect to important centers, population, or industry? We consider the forests, the lakes, the streams, the minerals, and of course the energy. Whether the nation state has natural gas or it has coal or of course petroleum is a very important element of its geographic richness, which is a critical part of a nation's power. Energy, of course, is today's great decisions topic. Just having the energy really doesn't solve the puzzle of being a great nation. If you look at this graph of oil reserves, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, these are not very impressive countries, yet they have amazing amounts of oil reserves. And then on the other end of the energy spectrum, a country like Japan, which is amazingly successful, wealthy, peaceful as a nation, and secure, and yet it has virtually no natural resources, energy or otherwise. So as we think about these anchors of power of any nation state, energy is part of geography, and geography is part of the larger calculation that makes a nation great or vulnerable to other nations and threats. We can grade the big three in terms of these three anchors of power. For the Russians, the grades that I assign are mediocre at best. The geostrategic location is weak because of the location of St. Petersburg, the flat plains of Ukraine and Belarus to the west, Caucasus Mountains, and then finally that long common border with China. The geography is rich, but is very difficult to get to because of permafrost and infrastructure challenges, and the Russian population pyramid is an utter disaster. China is a little bit better on population, a little bit worse on geographic richness, but overall China is not particularly impressive as we look at these three anchors. And then finally there is the United States, which is truly blessed. Our geostrategic location is better than any other. The geographic richness of our nation and our population is increasing over time and projected to continue, not too fast, not too slowly, at a very nice, healthy clip. And that puts the U.S. in the enviable position of being the most powerful nation in the world today and very likely for the foreseeable future. Geographic richness, of course, that is part of the energy calculation. It's not just about how much energy you have, it's also about how much energy you need and you use on a daily basis. So we have the energy production of nations here, China, the United States, India at the very top of the pyramid. But in terms of energy use, the US is also very high on the chart. And what that means is that for the most of our existence, the United States has been an energy deficit nation. We consume or use more energy than we produce ourselves. And that means we have to rely upon other nations to both produce energy and to export it to our market. We have to overlook many of their domestic and international sins because we need their energy. It makes us vulnerable to global supply chain disruptions. And of course, we have to spend a great deal of money securing delivery routes around the world. It also puts a lot of pressure on us to attain the resources of other nation states. They need to be willing trade partners in the energy field in order for the United States to import the oil, the gas, the electricity that we need for our growing economy. We now turn our attention to enhancing access to energy. There are two basic ways to get energy. One is old school realpolitik, a conservative view of the world. We saw that with Japan in the 1930s. It's a matter of conquest. Stiff arming, strong arming, even invading a nation to ensure that its energy flows into your domestic market. And then we have the much more liberal point of view, which is that, well, just like Japan after World War II, you import the energy, you trade for it. You use your comparative advantage, producing commodities and services that the world needs. You sell those on the global market and use the profits to purchase goods, services, energy from other countries. So Germany and Japan both turned into trading nations after World War II and relied upon international trade for their energy sources. The United States has predominantly favored the liberal point of view when it comes to energy. We have established a global system of stability by outlawing warfare and created a global trading order that allows the free, unfettered movement of oil, gas, and other energy sources across the international system. The growth in trade globally since 1950 is eye-popping. This is the American era of international leadership. Because of our global economic system, the one that we built, we've managed, and we've underwritten, the international system is wealthier, healthier, more prosperous, and safer than at any time in human history. If we were to extend the graph back 400, 500, 600 years, we would see the continual flat line. It's truly remarkable how the United States-led global economic system has grown since the 1950s. As we think about oil in particular, exports and imports, production and needs, this graph shows us how the United States production has skyrocketed in the second decade of the 21st century, and because of that, the green line, which is imports, has declined. We're now producing more energy than we need. We're still importing energy, and we always will. That has to do with the efficiency of global markets, but we've also entered since 2010 the global exporting market. We're exporting our energy and making a profit in the process. We finally turn our attention to strengths and weaknesses relating to energy geopolitics. America's strengths are as follows. We have enormous influence over other countries, including those that produce oil and natural gas. We dominate the global sea lanes, spending enormous amounts of money to do so, to secure them for the benefit of the international system. We do have the financial and physical capacity to significantly upgrade our energy infrastructure, something that the United States should truly focus on as our energy infrastructure is aging. And we also have remarkable domestic production potential. We have enormous amounts of gas and oil inside the United States, off our shores, and within our economic zones. Production of more energy means greater energy independence, more exports of energy, profits for the American economy. At the same time, there are significant weaknesses in the United States. We will always import energy from others, no matter how much we produce relative to how much we use. Just the nature of the trading system means we will import a great deal of energy, much of it refined in the form of gasoline. Our allies are much more vulnerable than is the United States. And if they are our allies, it means we have vested interest in their well-being. We have a responsibility and a self-interest to help them secure their energy sources. Our aging energy infrastructure, referenced earlier, vulnerable to cyber attacks and global supply chain disruptions. This graph shows us the cost in annual business losses related to grid problems. When our electrical grid goes down or is simply disrupted, the costs mount very quickly for major economies like California, Texas, Illinois, New York, and Florida. China is a meaningful challenger to the United States as it relates to our energy infrastructure. We believe that the Chinese have the capacity to cripple our power grid should they decide to do so. It, of course, doesn't mean they will, because the American counterattack will be overwhelming. Whether it is cyber or outright military, the U.S. has a number of weapons at its disposal to respond, but it does tell us there's a great degree of vulnerability for the U.S. There has been a movement of late to transition from fossil fuels into clean energy, renewable and non-fossil fuel sources of energy. This requires a great deal of investment. Our energy infrastructure is aging and needs to be updated. No one disagrees with that statement. And many argue that if we are going to update, why just patch it? Why not replace it with something that is more green related, that is more efficient, perhaps more productive, but also less reliant upon fossil fuels? Investment in infrastructure over the course of 3 years, 2018 to 2020, is reflected in this graph. If we are to reach by 2030 the national goal for emissions efficiency in our energy infrastructure, 2021's increase is only a drop in the bucket compared to the annual average that would be required. So I think it's pretty clear looking at this graph, we're not going to begin immediately to triple the amount of money that we put into our energy infrastructure. So that tells us we probably have to revise our goals, either extend 2030 as a target date out into the 2040s, or revise our goals to reach by the year 2030. We now turn to foreign policy options as it relates to energy geopolitics. In the brief introductory lecture, I introduced you to 4 foreign policy perspectives. each with varying degrees of support in the American public and the U.S. foreign policy establishment. We're going to look at energy geopolitics from the perspective of those four viewpoints. We begin with Realpolitik, or the conservative foreign policy approach, which believes that the United States, or any country, can only be truly safe and sound, strong as a nation, if it does not rely upon other countries for important or essential commodities. We must avoid dependency of foreign energy. We should control energy to the best of our ability from the source all the way to the point of sale. This was the case before 1973 and the OPEC oil shock. American companies, the Seven Sisters, controlled every aspect of oil exploration, exploitation, shipment, processing, marketing, and sales. That is no longer the case. So to have a goal to control all energy from the point of source to sale means we really need to focus on domestic production. It also views energy as a foreign policy tool. We can use it against other nations, rather bluntly, by blocking their energy exports, as we've done with Russia for the past year, or in a more refined way, by rewarding certain countries for their foreign policy approaches. Energy for the realist is a high politics issue, meaning it is a front burner one of critical national security interest and should never be relegated to second-tier status. The liberals take a very different view of the world and America's place within it, and they begin by a focus on energy as a global need. All nation states need access to reliable energy sources. If the United States is self-reliant, that's a bonus. But the reality is our allies and our trading partners need energy for their economies to progress and to be successful. And as a trading nation, we're better off if other nations grow economically as well. It fuels global trade, and they also promote clean energy. So the liberals take a completely different view about energy as a geopolitical issue. It is for them, however, a dual-edged sword. They understand the need for energy and they promote it globally, but at the same time, the more energy that is produced and used, the more likely it is that our climate will continue to deteriorate. The neocons, very popular in 2003 and for a handful of years during the younger Bush administration, their view on energy is rather similar to the realist. Avoid energy dependence, deny access to rising powers of American energy sources, and route energy away from any adversaries. Spend money, if necessary, building pipelines that avoid Iran, for example. Develop full energy independence is a consistent argument made by the neocons. The more self-reliant we are, the safer we are, and the more influential the United States will be. Then finally, we have the America First argument, which again is quite similar to two of the others. It's all about domestic production. They call for reducing regulations to allow greater exploration of energy, more exploitation in what many believe are fragile areas like Alaska, and provision of direct incentives. The government is more of a player under America First than any of the other perspectives. According to liberals like Adam Smith, in economic terms, the government should stay out of the way and only be a referee, only blowing the whistle when someone breaks a rule. For America Firsters, the government plays a central role in guiding the economy, picking winners and losers, providing tax incentives in order for there to be production of energy or other essential commodities. Climate change to the America Firsters is secondary. It's just not as important. It's not high politics. It's the sort of topic that's a luxury if other more important issues are addressed first. So as we think of energy in the context of American foreign policy, it can move in any of these directions. One of our foreign policy perspectives, liberal internationalism, points in this direction. Make it a global calculation with a very clear eye on climate concerns. For the other three, they move to the right-hand side of the diagram. prioritizing domestic interest and economic priorities over all other considerations as it relates to energy. For that reason, whether we elect Democrats or Republicans to Congress, to the White House, the American public is very clearly on this side of the line, and that tells us that America's foreign policy moving forward is much more likely to reflect an America First, neocon, or conservative realpolitik approach than it is the more traditional liberal internationalist. This concludes our first of 8 topics in this masterclass. I thank you for joining us and encourage you to visit fpa.org to stay engaged, order your Great Decisions Handbook, and continue to enjoy all of the benefits provided by the Foreign Policy Association. Until next time.